Hey folks, tonight we have something special for you as we embark on a relaxing journey back in time. We're going to explore a topic that's a bit unexpected. Don't worry, everything's at a gentle pace, perfect for a good night's sleep. The soothing sound of the Nile River will accompany us as we explore ancient Egyptian hygiene methods that would honestly make you deeply thankful for your modern shower and fluoride toothpaste. Imagine waking up in a hot morning, about 3,000 years ago, sand everywhere, no running water, and surrounded by cleaning methods that would make your dermatologist have a nervous breakdown. Before settling in and enjoying the video, how about leaving your like and subscribing to the channel? Only if you really enjoy what you're seeing, of course. Your support makes all the difference and motivates me to bring even more amazing content to you. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. The constant relaxing flow of the Nile waters will accompany us throughout this journey. Now, turn down the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. If it's too cold, grab a cozy blanket and let's begin tonight's journey together. Your eyes flutter open to the gentle sounds of the Nile flowing in the distance. It's dawn in ancient Egypt, somewhere around 1400 BCE during the glorious 18th dynasty. The first light of day filters through the small openings in your mud brick house walls. Already the air carries the distinct dry heat that defines Egyptian life, despite the early hour. You feel that familiar sensation of fine desert dust between your toes, in the corners of your eyes, and in your hair. Well, if you still had any hair, which you don't. But we'll get to that fascinating detail later. The continuous gentle murmur of the Nile serves as the backdrop to your existence. That great river, the lifeblood of Egyptian civilization, flows eternally just beyond your walls, a constant companion whose soothing sounds never cease. Each morning, the first thing you hear is this distant, calming flow of water, a sharp contrast to the arid landscape surrounding you. Your first challenge of the day is surprisingly complex, clearing your eyes enough to actually see. Egypt's famously dry climate, constant winds, and those dreaded Khamsin sandstorms leave you waking up each morning with eyes crusted shut from a mixture of dried tears and fine desert dust. To remedy this unfortunate situation, you reach for a small ceramic vessel beside your sleeping mat. Inside sits a dark, viscous liquid that modern archaeologists would nervously identify as coal, essentially, ground galena, which is lead sulfide. Yes, you're about to deliberately apply lead compounds to your eyes. The consistent sound of the Nile continues in the background as you dip a small wooden stick into the coal and carefully apply it to your waterline. The sensation would be strange to anyone not raised with this practice, but you've been doing this since childhood. What the ancient Egyptians discovered through trial and error, and what modern scientists confirmed millennia later, is that this toxic material actually offers some protection against eye infections while reducing the desert sun's intense glare. Congratulations, you're slowly poisoning yourself every morning in the name of eye health and hygiene, but at least your eyes will look stunning as your nervous system gradually fails. The melodic sound of the Nile's waters seems to grow louder as you prepare for your morning ablutions. Your spouse pours water from a heavy clay jar into a shallow basin for your use. No faucets here. Every drop of water is carried from the Nile in weighty vessels, typically by the women and children of the household. The gentle gurgling of water filling the simple basin reminds you of the river's constant flow. Now comes your first significant cleaning of the day, though calling it a bath would be generous. You dampen a linen cloth in the water and wipe it across your face and body, attempting to remove the layer of dust that accumulated during the night. The water isn't exactly clean. It has a slightly brownish tint since it comes directly from the Nile. Some of your wealthier neighbors might get water from wells, which is marginally cleaner, but still, we're far from mineral water here. The persistent sound of the Nile's flow seems to comment silently on this irony. The river provides life-giving water while simultaneously being the repository for waste and contaminants. As you clean yourself, you can almost feel the river's presence, its eternal cycle mirroring the daily rituals of Egyptian life. Historians still debate whether common Egyptians bathed daily, but we know cleanliness was valued, especially among higher classes. Priests, for example, performed ablutions several times a day as part of religious rituals. You, as an ordinary citizen, likely clean yourself thoroughly once daily, which ironically is already more frequent than many Europeans would do thousands of years later during the Middle Ages. You notice your skin is parched, a constant problem in the desert climate. Fortunately, you have a small pot of castor oil mixed with animal fat and aromatic herbs. Egyptians were masters at producing body oils, not just to moisturize skin, but also to mask body odors. You apply it generously, leaving your skin with an oily sheen that, in Egypt's heat, will melt and trickle down your body throughout the day. At least you won't feel like a fish drying in the sun. The never-ending sound of the Nile continues, flowing eternally like time itself, as you prepare to face another day in ancient Egypt. Your morning hygiene routine has only just begun, and already modern observers would be horrified by the toxic substances and questionable cleaning methods. But for you, this is simply life, a constant battle against the elements, fought with the limited but ingenious tools available to your civilization. As the day advances, the constant sound of the Nile grows louder as you and a small group of neighbors make your way toward its banks. Your basic home cleaning routine was merely the appetizer. For a proper cleansing, nothing beats immersing yourself in the sacred waters of the Great River. The soothing, rhythmic flow of the Nile intensifies as you approach its shores, that eternal sound that has defined Egyptian existence for thousands of years. You reach the riverbank and survey the scene. A vast expanse of greenish-brown water flowing with unhurried determination. The Nile isn't merely Egypt's water source. It's the reason the entire civilization exists. Its annual floods bring fertile silt that transforms desert into farmland. It's the main highway connecting the entire country. It's venerated as a deity. And, as you're about to experience, it's also your communal bathtub, laundromat, and drinking water source all in one. Efficiency at its finest. The constant murmur of the Nile's waters against the shore creates a hypnotic backdrop as you prepare to enter. Perhaps this is a good moment to mention the river's other inhabitants, Nile crocodiles, which can grow longer than your entire house and have jaws powerful enough to snap a wooden oar in half. Hippopotamuses, which despite their rotund, seemingly comical appearance, kill more people in Africa than any other large animal, and billions of microorganisms that would absolutely love to take up residence in your intestines. The continuous sound of the Nile seems almost deceptive now, so peaceful, yet concealing so many dangers. The safest time for bathing is mid-morning, an older neighbor reminds everyone, his voice nearly drowned by the river's constant flow. Crocodiles hunt mostly at dawn and dusk. This tidbit of survival knowledge has been passed down through generations of Egyptians who've learned to coexist with these ancient predators. You scan the water's surface carefully, looking for any suspicious logs that might have eyes. You cautiously enter the water along with other bathers, keeping a vigilant eye for any suspicious movements beneath the surface. The sound of the Nile envelops you now, the water's gentle burbling mixing with voices and laughter of others also performing their morning hygiene. Egyptians believed the river had purifying properties, which technically isn't wrong, as water generally does clean things. The problem is that this same water is contaminated with everything that's been dumped upstream, human and animal waste, decomposing carcasses, and all manner of organic trash. A small boy splashes nearby, giggling as he dodges his mother's attempts to scrub behind his ears. "Stay in the shallows," she calls, her voice competing with the constant flow of the river. You realize he can't swim. Like many Egyptians, drowning is actually a significant cause of death in your society, particularly for children. The Nile gives life, but it takes it just as easily. You begin washing yourself, but not with soap. That would be an unimaginable luxury. Instead, you use what ancient Egyptians considered the cleaning product par excellence, natron. This natural alkaline substance, essentially sodium carbonate, is found in deposits throughout the Nile Valley and has degreasing properties. Mixed with a little water, it forms a paste that Egyptians used for practically everything: washing bodies, cleaning clothes, scrubbing floors, preserving mummies. A true multi-purpose product. The continuous sound of the Nile seems to intensify as you scrub your skin with this caustic substance. The natron forms a strange lather when it contacts your skin's natural oils. The sensation isn't exactly pleasant. It feels like you're being mildly corroded, which, in fact, is happening at a microscopic level. Your skin will probably be dried out afterward, but at least you'll be clean by ancient Egyptian standards. Be careful with your eyes, warns an elderly woman nearby, her voice barely audible over the Nile's constant flow. "I once got natron in my eyes during washing. Couldn't see properly for 3 days." She points to a slightly clouded eye, a permanent reminder of the harsh realities of Egyptian hygiene. You nod appreciatively at this wisdom shared, and take extra care with your cleaning. One of the most curious aspects of Egyptian hygiene is the near-complete absence of soap as we know it today. Although there's evidence that Egyptians occasionally used a mixture of vegetable or animal fats with ashes, the basic principle of soap, this product wasn't common. Historians still debate whether ancient Egypt independently developed soap or learned the concept from other peoples. Either way, you, as an ordinary Egyptian, are cleaning yourself with an alkaline substance that removes dirt, but also part of your skin. Who needs chemical exfoliation when you have natron, right? While bathing, you notice some people using an alternative method, scrubbing themselves with fine sand. Yes, sand. In the desert, when water is scarce, Egyptians used sand as an abrasive to remove dirt, sweat, and dead cells. It's like sandpaper for humans, and surprisingly, it works, removing the surface layer of skin, along with any dirt. Of course, you emerge from your bath, looking like you've been exfoliated with a kitchen grater, but at least you're technically clean. By comparison, your natron bath in the Nile seems luxurious. The continuous sound of the Nile provides a soothing backdrop as you observe a group of temple attendants at a secluded spot upstream, performing a more elaborate purification ritual. For priests, cleanliness wasn't just a matter of hygiene, but a religious obligation. They bathed several times a day, shaved all body hair to avoid lice and other parasites that could contaminate sacred rituals, and wore pure linen garments, constantly washed. "They're preparing for the monthly offering," explains a friend, his voice blending with the river's eternal flow. Cleanliness brings them closer to the gods. The concept makes perfect sense in Egyptian theology. Purity of body reflects purity of spirit. The priests' elaborate bathing rituals, performed to the constant soundtrack of the flowing Nile, represent the ideal that ordinary Egyptians approximate with their simpler ablutions. You finish your bath and exit the water, still dripping. There are no towels in ancient Egypt. You simply wait to dry in the sun, which doesn't take long in this scorching climate. The Nile water evaporates quickly from your skin, leaving behind a fine layer of silt and sediments. Congratulations, you've just exchanged your original dirt for a new layer of river mud. But at least it's different mud, and that's considered progress. As you move away from the shore, the sound of the Nile continues in the background, that eternal flow that has witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties. It's comforting to know the river will be there tomorrow, and the day after, and for thousands of years to come. The same can't be said about your skin after this daily treatment with caustic substances and abrasive sand. But at least you don't need to worry about antiperspirants, deodorants, or shampoos, problems of the modern human. You begin to feel your skin rapidly drying under Egypt's merciless sun. The sensation is unpleasant, stretched, rough, and already accumulating a new layer of dust from the environment. This is just the first stage of your hygiene routine, and you're already missing your 21st century moisturizer. But don't worry, Egyptians have solutions for dry skin too, though perhaps you'd prefer to continue with the dry skin after discovering what they used. The constant soothing sound of the Nile remains your faithful companion as you return home, your skin irritated and dried out from your purifying bath. Now begins what might be the most economically significant part of Egyptian hygiene, the application of oils and unguents. The marketplace for these products is as ancient as the pyramids themselves, with entire trading networks dedicated to sourcing ingredients from across the known world. "Fresh oils, oils from the finest sources," calls a merchant as you pass through the small market area near your home. The constant murmur of the Nile mingles with the bustle of commerce. "I have cedar oil from Lebanon, olive oil from Crete, balanos oil from the western oases." His wooden stall is lined with containers of various sizes and materials. Clay pots, alabaster jars, and tiny faience bottles for the most precious blends. You approach, examining his wares with practiced eyes. "What do you recommend for skin after river bathing?" you ask, the sound of the Nile a constant reminder of your recent ablutions. "Ah, you need moringa oil mixed with lotus extract," he replies confidently. "Perfect for restoring moisture after natron washing, used by Queen Nefertiti herself." This last claim is almost certainly fabrication, but the recommendation is sound. Moringa oil was indeed one of Egypt's most prized moisturizers, extracted from seeds of the moringa tree that grows abundantly along the Nile Delta. The eternal sound of the Nile seems to acknowledge this connection. The river nurtures the trees that provide the oil that soothes the skin dried by the river's water. It's a perfect cycle of give and take that characterizes Egyptian life. You purchase a small pot of the recommended oil and continue homeward. Inside your modest dwelling, you arrange your collection of skin treatments on a low wooden table. The pungent, distinctive aroma of these products fills the room. A mixture of rancid animal fat, vegetable oils, and aromatic herbs that would, to modern noses, be absolutely overwhelming. To you, however, it's the scent of cleanliness and status. Best apply the oil while your skin is still warm from the sun, advises your spouse, who's preparing the day's bread dough nearby. The constant sound of the Nile drifts through your open windows as you begin your anointing ritual. You start with the basic moringa oil, pouring a generous amount into your palm and applying it liberally across your body. The sensation is immediate. Your parched skin absorbs the oil like the desert soaks up rare rainfall. After days in Egypt's dry climate and relentless sun exposure, your body is practically begging for hydration. The distant sound of the flowing Nile seems almost mocking now. So much water, yet your skin remains desperately dry. Those of us who work in the fields need something stronger, comments your neighbor, a farmer who stopped by to borrow a grinding stone. Regular oil just sweats off by midday. I mix in beeswax to make it stay longer. He shows you his arms, coated with a thicker, more occlusive mixture that withstands hours of labor under the blistering sun. The persistent sound of the Nile continues as you compare skincare routines. An unlikely conversation by modern standards, but perfectly normal in a society where proper skin protection could mean the difference between comfort and agony. Historians continue to debate which animal fats were preferred for Egyptian cosmetics. Some papyri mention hippopotamus fat as particularly valued, while others suggest crocodile fat had magical properties for the skin. You, as an ordinary Egyptian, likely use beef or sheep fat. Less exotic, but equally effective and malodorous. The constant murmur of the Nile provides a counterpoint to these discussions of animal-based skincare. During inundation season, we need waterproof oils, explains an older woman who's joined the impromptu skincare gathering at your home. When the Nile floods, humidity is high, and regular oils wash away with sweat. She recommends a thicker paste made with resin from terebinth trees mixed with beeswax, a waterproof coating that lasts through the flood season's humidity. The sound of the Nile flows continuously in the background, its annual cycles dictating not just agriculture, but even skincare routines. For professional reasons, different Egyptians required specialized formulations. Fishermen needed waterproof protection. Stonemasons needed thick creams to prevent limestone dust from drying their skin, and metalworkers required heat-resistant formulations. An entire industry of specialized skincare existed millennia before modern occupational health considerations. The eternal sound of the Nile accompanied each profession as they applied their specific protective layers. As you apply these mixtures, you must remain vigilant about insects. The oils and fats are irresistible to flies and other bugs, making you a walking insect magnet. Add a bit of crushed marigold to your mix, suggests a visitor. Keeps the flies away somewhat. The sound of the Nile carries onward, indifferent to these small miseries of Egyptian life. For your face, you have a special mixture, sweet almond oil blended with milk and honey. This combination is reserved for more sensitive areas and represents a luxury that not all Egyptians can afford. Milk contains natural acids, lactic acid, as modern dermatologists would call it, that gently exfoliate the skin, while honey has antibacterial and humectant properties. The Nile's constant murmur seems almost approving as you apply this relatively sophisticated formula. The scribes at the temple use clay masks from the Nile banks mixed with honey and olive oil, shares a young boy who works as a temple messenger. It keeps their skin cool during long writing sessions. The sound of the great river continues, reminding you subtly that its gifts extend beyond water to the very clay used in beauty treatments. Seasonal variations in skincare were crucial in the extreme Egyptian climate. Winter brought dry winds requiring heavier oils, while summer's intense heat called for lighter, more frequent applications. The sound of the Nile remained constant through these seasonal shifts, its flow unchanging while everything around it adapted to nature's cycles. For celebration days, we used to add crushed flowers to our oils, reminisces an elderly family member. Lotus for rebirth, blue lily for visions, jasmine for romance. These special occasion blends weren't just cosmetic, but symbolic, connecting physical care with spiritual meanings. The sound of the Nile flows eternally in the background, witnessing these traditions pass through generations. After completing your thorough application, you're technically clean by Egyptian standards. Your skin is protected against the sun, moisturized to combat the dry climate, and perfumed to mask body odors. The fact that you now resemble someone who's been dipped in cooking oil and smell like a mixture of butcher shop and botanical garden is simply a side effect of Egyptian beauty. At least you're no longer covered in sand and dust, until you step outside again, of course. The continuous sound of the Nile flows without ceasing, like time passing, reminding you that tomorrow you'll need to repeat this entire process again. Hygiene in ancient Egypt isn't an occasional event. It's a daily battle against the elements. But you're prepared, armed with your oils, fats, and unguents, at least until the next sandstorm. The constant flow of the Nile continues its eternal symphony, as you confront perhaps the most dreaded aspect of Egyptian hygiene: dental care. If you think mint-flavored toothpaste is unpleasant, prepare yourself for an experience that would make modern dentists weep into their sterilized instruments. "Open wider, let me see," demands Amenhotep, the neighborhood tooth man who stopped by your home after hearing about your recent complaints of tooth pain. He's not a physician, those are reserved for the wealthy, but he has a reputation for knowing more about teeth than most. The ever-present sound of the Nile drifts through your windows as you reluctantly open your mouth for inspection. Dental hygiene in ancient Egypt is, at best, primitive. There are no toothbrushes as you'd recognize them, no dental floss, and definitely no mint-flavored mouthwash. Instead, Amenhotep hands you what looks like a simple twig. "Chew this end until the fibers separate," he instructs, his voice mixing with the background murmur of the great river. Salvadora persica, the best tooth-cleaning stick in all of Lower Egypt. The temple priests use nothing else. You take the stick, known centuries later as a miswak, and begin chewing one end as directed. The wood fibers separate, creating something vaguely resembling a primitive brush. With this improvised tool, you scrub your teeth, attempting to remove food remnants and the bacterial plaque causing your morning breath. The sound of the Nile seems almost to chuckle at your efforts as you vigorously work the stick against your aching teeth. "Be careful around the black spots," warns Amenhotep, pointing to several obvious cavities. "Those are hollow and will cause pain if you press too hard." Curiously, this technique is surprisingly effective. The Salvadora persica twigs contain natural antibacterial compounds and abrasive fibers that genuinely help with cleaning. Archaeologists examining Egyptian mummies are often surprised by the relatively decent state of their teeth, considering the lack of modern dentistry. Of course, relatively decent still means full of cavities, extreme wear, and occasionally fatal infections. But hey, you're trying. "My father traded with Nubians who used a different kind of stick," offers a young merchant who's visiting from the southern frontier regions. "They scrape their teeth with special roots that turn the gums red but keep teeth strong." The eternal sound of the Nile continues, flowing like the exchange of dental knowledge between different cultures along its banks. The Nile market where tooth cleaning implements are sold is a fascinating microcosm of Egyptian dental innovation. Various vendors hawk different solutions: twigs from different trees, abrasive powders, herb bundles for chewing. "Try my special mixture," calls one enterprising seller. Ground pumice stone, burnt ox hooves, and white honey removes wine stains from noble teeth. The sound of the great river provides constant background music to this dental marketplace. To complete your cleaning routine, you use a concoction recommended by Amenhotep, a mixture of rock salt, mint leaves, and dried iris flowers ground into a fine powder. This abrasive paste, literally made from crushed minerals and botanicals, is rubbed on the teeth with your fingers or with your chewed stick. The taste is precisely as horrible as it sounds, but the slight antiseptic properties of some ingredients and the abrasiveness help remove stains. They also gradually remove your tooth enamel, but that's a detail you prefer to ignore. The palace scribes use a different formula, shares a woman whose cousin serves in the royal household. Frankincense powder mixed with fresh honey and green myrrh. Costs more than a month's grain ration. The continuous sound of the Nile seems indifferent to these class distinctions in dental care, as it flows past both palatial gardens and humble dwellings alike. After vigorously scrubbing your teeth, you need to rinse. With no running water, you use some of the water fetched earlier from the Nile and stored in a ceramic jar. Yes, you're rinsing your mouth with the same water that likely contains microscopic amounts of human waste, various parasites, and festive bacteria. The circle of life completes itself as the sound of the great river resonates slightly inside the water jar. Careful not to swallow, cautions an elderly neighbor watching your routine. River water can bring stomach troubles if you drink it straight. This is perhaps the understatement of the 3rd millennium BCE, but you appreciate the advice nonetheless. A curious fact that historians continue to debate. Although Egyptians had no formal dentistry, there is evidence of primitive attempts at dental procedures. Mummies have been found with teeth bound with gold wire to prevent them from falling out, and others with evidence of abscess drainage. If you're unfortunate enough to develop a serious dental issue, your options are limited to herbal remedies, ranging from surprisingly effective to completely useless, or the intervention of a physician priest who might attribute your toothache to a demon and attempt to exorcise it. My grandfather had a tooth pulled by the temple physician, shares a craftsman working nearby. They used a specialized bronze tool. He said the pain was worse than being kicked by an ox, but the relief afterward was worth it. The sound of the Nile continues flowing, eternally witnessing these small human dramas of pain and relief. The constant background murmur of the Nile accompanies your dental contemplations. Egyptian bread, a dietary staple, often contains sand particles from the grinding process, meaning your teeth are being continuously abraded with every meal. The average life expectancy in ancient Egypt is about 30–35 years, and untreated dental problems are a common cause of premature death. Nothing like a dental infection to send you to the afterlife ahead of schedule. After finishing your dental routine, you notice a metallic taste in your mouth, probably your tooth enamel being slowly eroded, or perhaps some gum bleeding caused by your improvised brush. Either way, you need to mask this taste and your breath, which still isn't exactly fresh as a desert morning breeze. Chew these, offers Amenhotep, handing you some cardamom pods. Imported from lands far to the east, nobles use them after meals to sweeten their words to Pharaoh. You accept the gift gratefully. Such luxuries are rarely available to common Egyptians. More typically, you might chew cumin seeds or anise, which both mask odors and stimulate saliva production. The sound of the Nile flows continuously, mixing with the slight crackling of spices between your teeth as you diligently chew. For the wealthy, there are more luxurious options. Balls made of honey, cinnamon, and myrrh, a high-end treatment reserved for the upper classes. The continuous sound of the great river remains democratic, however, flowing past palaces and hovels without discrimination. An interesting detail. Egyptians believed toothaches were caused by toothworms, small demons in worm form that gnawed teeth from the inside. They weren't entirely wrong. Bacteria do exactly that, though they're not exactly demons, depending on your perspective, of course. Treatments included poultices of onion, garlic, and honey applied directly to the affected tooth, which surprisingly may have offered some relief thanks to these ingredients' antibacterial properties. The Nile water, whose sound remains your constant background companion, also played its role in Egyptian dental health. Unfortunately, not a positive one. The water contained natural fluoride in some stretches of the river, which could strengthen teeth, but also harbored numerous bacteria that could colonize gum lesions, causing potentially fatal infections. After chewing your spices long enough, you consider yourself ready to face social interactions without completely offending others' noses. Your breath is now an interesting mixture of spices, not completely removed food residue, and that special touch of animal horn ashes. Certainly not refreshing mint, but by ancient Egyptian standards, you're practically using mouthwash. You smile to test your freshly cleaned teeth. Several already show signs of severe wear. Some have permanent stains, and one or two have that sensitivity suggesting you'll soon experience a night of agony, followed by a forced extraction. But hey, at least you're trying, which is more than can be said for many future civilizations. The eternal murmur of the Nile continues, reminding you that life goes on, with or without all your teeth. Amazing how something as basic as brushing teeth in the modern world would be considered an unimaginable luxury in the past. And the scariest part? Your Egyptian dental routine is still in its infancy. Humanity has thousands of years of painful dental experimentation ahead before reaching fluoride toothpaste and soft bristled brushes. The eternal sound of the Nile continues its serene flow as you prepare for the next essential stage of Egyptian hygiene, applying makeup. In this scorching land where the sun beats down relentlessly, cosmetics aren't merely decorative, they're protective, spiritual, and medicinal all at once. And unlike modern beauty products with their safety testing and regulations, Egyptian makeup is a fascinating cocktail of minerals, many of which would make a modern toxicologist reach for their hazmat suit. Neferka, are you going to the temple ceremony today? Calls your neighbor Mary Amun, who's already adorned with the classic Egyptian eye makeup. I have some fresh coal if you need it. Just ground it myself this morning. The constant murmur of the Nile provides a soothing backdrop to this neighborly exchange. At the mention of fresh coal, you immediately perk up. Quality matters when it comes to eye cosmetics, and Mary Amun's husband works in the mining district, giving her access to premium galena ore for making the finest coal. The fact that this ore is essentially lead sulfide, a neurotoxin that accumulates in your body over time, is an inconvenient detail overshadowed by its effectiveness and cultural importance. I'd be grateful, you reply, the sound of the Nile flowing steadily through your conversation. The grain official is inspecting harvests today, and one must look presentable. Inside your home, you arrange your cosmetic implements on a low table, polished copper mirrors, small alabaster pots for various compounds, delicate application sticks, and grinding palettes. These aren't merely beautification tools, they're status symbols, often buried with their owners to ensure beauty in the afterlife. The constant sound of the Nile drifts through your window as you begin your transformation. You start with the foundation of all Egyptian makeup, a layer of white lead-based powder. This creates a lighter complexion, valued as a sign that one doesn't have to labor in the fields under the harsh sun. The powder is applied to your face, neck, and shoulders, creating a smooth canvas for further embellishments. The continuous murmur of the Nile seems to whisper cautions you cannot hear about the cumulative poisoning this practice will cause over years. I learned a new technique from a palace servant, shares Mary Amun, who has joined you for the makeup ritual. They mix the white base with a little honey before applying it. It adheres better during religious ceremonies when one might sweat under the incense smoke. The sound of the Nile flows eternally as you implement this valuable tip, unaware that the honey actually helps accelerate the absorption of lead compounds through your skin. Next comes the defining feature of Egyptian cosmetics, elaborate eye makeup. You reach for the fresh coal Mary Amun brought, a fine black powder with a slightly metallic sheen. Using a thin wooden applicator dipped in a drop of water, you begin the meticulous process of lining your eyes. The sound of the Nile continues its steady rhythm as you extend the line outward toward your temples in the distinctive Egyptian style. Extend it further on the upper lids, suggests an elderly aunt who stopped by. When I served in the temple of Hathor in my youth, the priestesses taught that the wider the coal line, the greater the protection from Eye of Ra's harsh gaze. The eternal sound of the great river flows on as you follow this advice, creating a bold outline that frames your eyes dramatically. Interestingly, Egyptians weren't completely wrong about coal's protective properties. Modern studies have discovered that this lead-based eye makeup actually helped combat eye infections caused by contaminated water, like that of the Nile, whose sound continuously accompanies your life, and reduced sun glare, functioning like the world's first sunglasses. It's unfortunate that the same product protecting your eyes was also slowly destroying your nervous system, cell by cell. A rather extreme case of trading long-term health for short-term benefits. For your eyelids, you apply a vibrant green powder made from malachite, a copper ore mineral that gives a striking blue-green color. The green symbolizes the fresh papyrus plants after the Nile's inundation, explains your aunt. It represents rebirth and Osiris's domain. The sound of the great river seems to acknowledge this connection as you pat the mineral powder onto your lids. Those who can afford it use ground lapis lazuli for special occasions, sighs Mary Amun wistfully. the blue of the heavens themselves. I saw the high priestess wearing it during last year's Opet festival. The sound of the Nile continues, indifferent to these class distinctions in cosmetic luxury. For your cheeks and lips, you use red ochre, an iron oxide-based pigment that's relatively safe compared to your other cosmetics. The preparation is mixed with a little animal fat to help it adhere to the skin. Not too much, cautions your aunt. Excessive rouge is for women of questionable reputation. The sound of the Nile flows steadily on as you apply a modest amount to your lips and cheekbones. In the palace, they've been using a new red paste made with cinnabar imported from distant eastern lands. Mentions a basket seller who's arrived with fresh wares. Beautiful color, like the reddest sunset over the Nile. 3 courtiers died last month from mysterious shaking illnesses. Probably a curse. Neither she nor anyone else makes the connection that cinnabar is mercury sulfide, and those cursed courtiers were suffering from mercury poisoning. The eternal sound of the Nile continues, carrying away secrets and connections unrecognized. Curiously, Egyptian men also regularly wore makeup, especially kohl around the eyes. There was no gender stigma associated with cosmetics as in many later cultures. Pharaohs, priests, scribes, and warriors all carefully applied toxic eyeliner before their daily activities. The continuous sound of the Nile made no distinction between male and female usage of cosmetics. Both were equally susceptible to their beautifying and poisoning effects. My husband works in the temple as a scribe, shares Mariamon. He uses kohl every day. Says it helps him see the hieroglyphs better in dim light. His father lived to be 50 working as a scribe, so it must be healthy. You nod in agreement. The sound of the Nile flowing constantly like the collective misconceptions about cosmetic safety that would persist for millennia. For religious ceremonies, different color combinations held specific meanings. White represents purity and is sacred to Thoth, explains your aunt, who seems determined to turn your makeup session into a theological lesson. Black symbolizes fertility and rebirth, connected to the soil left by the Nile floods. Green is for new life, red for vitality and protection. The sound of the great river continues, its waters carrying the very minerals that create these symbolic colors. To set your makeup and ensure it lasts through Egypt's intense heat, you apply a thin layer of scented oil over everything except your eyes. This creates the characteristic Egyptian glow that's highly valued aesthetically. The sound of the Nile flows eternally as you admire your transformation in the polished copper mirror. Beautiful. Hathor herself would approve, declares your aunt, referring to the goddess of beauty. Remember that your cosmetics aren't just for appearance. They create a protective barrier between your spirit and evil influences. This spiritual dimension of makeup was taken very seriously. Certain patterns around the eyes were considered protection against the evil eye and malevolent forces. The continuous sound of the Nile seems to reinforce this belief in invisible protections against invisible threats. Ironically, your potentially deadly makeup might actually extend your presence on Earth. The preservative properties of lead and copper compounds would help preserve your mummified body, should you be fortunate enough to afford proper burial preparations. It's small comfort to know that the same kohl that might be shortening your life will help preserve your corpse spectacularly. The eternal murmur of the Nile continues, indifferent to these paradoxes of Egyptian existence. There's a new shipment of imported antimony at the market, mentions the basket seller as she leaves. Makes an excellent gray kohl variant. Only costs 3 months' worth of grain. The sound of the great river flows on, witnessing the economic inequalities that determine even access to toxic beauty products. Fully made up, with dramatically lined eyes, colored lids, rouged cheeks, and an overall luminous finish, you're now properly prepared to face the social obligations of the day. Your elaborate appearance isn't vanity. It's a social necessity, a spiritual protection, and a health measure all in one. The fact that it's slowly poisoning you is just an unfortunate side effect of beauty in an age before toxicology. The sound of the Nile continues its eternal flow, carrying away the years of your life just as surely as it carries the minerals that create your striking appearance. The constant sound of the Nile continues its eternal flow as you face perhaps the most radical aspect of Egyptian hygiene, hair management, or more accurately, hair elimination. Because in ancient Egypt, the ultimate solution to hair problems isn't special oils, elaborate styling, or herbal treatments. It's complete and systematic removal. The smooth, hairless head isn't just fashionable. It's practically mandatory for anyone with aspirations above peasant status. Hold still now, instructs Ptah Hotep, the neighborhood barber who visits homes of those who can afford his services. His bronze razor glints in the morning light as the sound of the Nile provides a soothing backdrop to what is about to be a rather uncomfortable procedure. The temple needs new apprentice scribes. You want to make a good impression, yes? No scribe keeps hair. It's uncivilized. The razor begins its work, scraping rather than cutting, as the blade isn't particularly sharp by modern standards. The sensation isn't pleasant. It's somewhere between irritating and painful as the bronze edge drags across your scalp, occasionally leaving small nicks that sting when sweat trickles into them. The constant murmur of the Nile seems almost sympathetic to your discomfort. I served as barber to the overseer of granaries for 12 years. Ptah Hotep shares as he works, his voice mixing with the ever-present sound of the river. He insisted on a fresh shave every 3 days, even during travel. Once made me bring my razors during a desert expedition to the turquoise mines. Can you imagine? Shaving in a sandstorm. He chuckles at the memory while you wince as the razor finds another sensitive spot. Why this extreme approach to hair management? The answer crawls and bites. Lice. These tiny parasites thrive in the warm Egyptian climate and proliferate in human hair. In an era without specialized anti-parasitic shampoos, the only truly effective solution is habitat elimination. The sound of the Nile flows endlessly, as you consider that this drastic measure is, ultimately, quite practical in a land where parasites are as common as grains of sand. The priests of Amun shave every part of their bodies every 2 days, offers a woman waiting for her husband's turn with the barber. They say hair harbors impurities that offend the gods. My cousin serves in the temple, says the high priest inspects them regularly for missed spots. The continuous sound of the great river provides a counterpoint to these observations about religious hygiene requirements. Men and women, from pharaoh to modest craftspeople, frequently shave their heads completely. If someone you know maintains natural hair, they either dedicate significant daily time to parasite control or belong to a social class so low they couldn't access even a bronze razor to borrow. The eternal sound of the Nile continues, indifferent to these social distinctions marked by the presence or absence of hair. My brother works in the royal wig workshop, mentions Ptah Hotep as he finishes your shave, wiping away the last bits of hair and blood droplets from minor cuts. The inventory records are impressive. The god's wife of Amun has 17 different ceremonial wigs. 17. Some weighing as much as a small child. The sound of the Nile seems almost to chuckle at this extravagance, as you contemplate the apparent paradox. Remove all natural hair, only to wear artificial hair instead. After thoroughly scraping your scalp, and eyebrows for good measure, you're ready for the next stage, wig fitting. Because after eliminating your natural hair, you now need a substitute for public appearances. The sound of the Nile continues its steady flow as you examine your wig options, spread before you on reed mats. This one would suit your face shape, suggests Meret Neith, a local wig maker whose workshop supplies medium-quality pieces to those who aren't nobility, but can afford better than crude hair pieces. Human hair mixed with date palm fibers for volume. The temple workers prefer this style, practical but respectable. The constant murmur of the Nile accompanies your consideration of this significant purchase. Egyptian wigs weren't just fashion statements, they were engineering achievements. The elaborate constructions involved attaching hair strands to a net base, layer by layer, creating structures that could last for years with proper care. For the wealthy, wigs made of human hair, often obtained from slaves or sold by peasants for extra income, were styled in complex arrangements with curls, braids, and layers. The background sound of the great river continues as you marvel at these products of ancient ingenuity. The royal wig makers use beeswax mixed with resins from the land of Punt to set the curls, explains Meret Neith, clearly proud of her industry knowledge. They add gold dust to the pharaoh's festival wigs. Imagine gold in your hair. Of course, for everyday wigs like these, we use carob bean paste. Still holds well in the heat. The sound of the Nile flows steadily on as you learn these trade secrets. You select a medium-quality wig that suits your station in life, neither too elaborate to seem presumptuous, nor too simple to appear undignified. The constant background murmur of the river seems approving as Neith carefully fits it to your freshly shaved head. "Some adjustments needed here," she mutters, making small modifications to ensure proper fit. A loose wig in a sudden wind gust can be quite embarrassing. "Remember what happened to that tax collector last Harvest Festival? Had to chase his wig halfway to Memphis." The eternal sound of the Nile flows on, witness to countless such moments of dignity lost to desert winds. A curious detail. Wig maintenance was surprisingly complex. Regular combing with wooden or ivory combs, occasional washing with mild natron solution, reapplication of scented oils, and storage on special wooden stands when not in use. Some elaborate wigs needed their own dedicated servants for upkeep. The constant sound of the Nile continues as you realize that avoiding natural hair problems has simply introduced a different set of maintenance issues. "For special occasions, you might consider a scented wax cone," suggests Ptah Hotep, pointing to small conical objects on Neith's display table, placed atop the wig during festivals and banquets. The heat of the room gradually melts it, releasing perfume and conditioning the wig simultaneously. These fragrance cones, as archaeologists would later call them, were a distinctive feature of Egyptian fashion, visible in numerous tomb paintings. The sound of the Nile flows on, indifferent to these strategies for combining practicality with aesthetic appeal. Wig wearing wasn't limited to the upper classes, though quality varied dramatically with social status. Farmers and laborers often wore simple versions made from plant fibers or wool, providing sun protection without the expense of human hair. The continuous sound of the Great River accompanies this democratic aspect of Egyptian fashion. Everyone participated, just at different quality levels. "When storing your wig overnight, remember to use a proper headrest," advises Neith as she makes final adjustments. Flat pillows crush the structure. The curved wooden neck supports keep everything elevated and intact. These distinctive curved headrests, uncomfortable by modern standards, were essential tools for preserving elaborate hairstyles. The eternal murmur of the Nile flows on as you contemplate how the pursuit of beauty often involves significant discomfort. Now properly outfitted with your smooth, shaved head and appropriately styled wig, you're ready to face Egyptian society with the proper appearance. The constant irony isn't lost on you. Remove all natural hair to replace it with artificial hair that requires even more maintenance. But at least you've dramatically reduced your parasite population, and in the scorching Egyptian climate, the air circulation around your scalp beneath the wig provides welcome cooling. The sound of the Nile continues, eternal and unchanging, unlike the ever-evolving fashions balanced precariously on Egyptian heads. The eternal sound of the Nile continues its soothing flow, but there's nothing soothing about what comes next in your Egyptian hygiene regimen. Because hair removal in ancient Egypt doesn't stop at your head. Oh no, that would be far too simple. The cultural ideal demands complete smoothness from head to toe, a state that modern estheticians might call full-body deforestation, and that requires methods ranging from uncomfortable to downright dangerous. "The flood season is approaching, when the gods pay closest attention to our purity," announces your household's matriarch as she prepares the hair removal supplies. "We must all be properly smoothed before the first waters rise." The constant murmur of the Nile seems almost ominous now, as if the river itself is setting the deadline for this uncomfortable ritual. The central belief driving this practice is simple: body hair is unclean. It traps dirt, provides hiding places for parasites, and marks one as lower class or even barbaric. The elite of Egyptian society, priests, nobles, and royalty, are depicted in art as completely hairless, their smooth skin representing purity and refinement. The sound of the Great River flows continuously as you prepare to conform to this demanding beauty standard. "I've prepared 2 methods," explains Nefertari, a woman from your neighborhood known for her skill with depilatory preparations. "The quick paste for large areas, or the honey method for more delicate regions." She lays out her tools on a reed mat: clay mixing bowls, applicator sticks, and several suspicious-looking pouches of powder. The constant sound of the Nile provides background music to what promises to be an uncomfortable session. The quick paste is the standard hair removal method for most Egyptians, and its recipe has survived in medical papyri. Slaked lime mixed with a yellowish mineral called orpiment, which modern chemists would identify as arsenic trisulfide, water, and starch to form a paste. Yes, you read correctly. Arsenic. A substance modern warning labels would festoon with skull symbols is about to be deliberately applied to your skin. The eternal murmur of the Nile continues, indifferent to this potential poisoning in the name of beauty. This batch is fresh. Made it this morning, says Nefertari proudly as she mixes the components in a clay bowl. The trick is getting the consistency right. Too thin, it runs everywhere. Too thick, it doesn't penetrate the hair follicles properly. The sound of the Nile flows steadily on as she creates what is essentially a chemical weapon designed to dissolve keratin, the protein in hair, along with whatever skin cells happen to be in the vicinity. A small group has gathered for this communal beauty ritual. Several neighbors, each awaiting their turn with either dread or resignation. I heard the royal concubines use a different formula, whispers one woman, with honey and special oils from punt that make the skin smooth as alabaster afterward. Another snorts dismissively. And I heard the royal embalmers use ibis beaks as tweezers. Palace rumors are worth less than chaff. The constant sound of the great river continues through this exchange of beauty gossip. Your turn comes, and Nefertari applies the caustic paste to your arms first, using a flat wooden spatula. The sensation begins as warmth, progresses to tingling, and quickly advances to burning. That means it's working, she assures you. The sound of the Nile almost, but not quite, masking your involuntary hiss of discomfort. The stronger the burn, the cleaner the result. After an agonizing few minutes, timed by Nefertari with practiced precision, she scrapes the mixture off using another wooden tool. The hair comes away with it, dissolved at the roots, along with the top layer of your skin. The result? Smooth skin that's also irritated, red, and slightly chemically burned. Beauty is pain, as they'll say for the next several thousand years. The eternal sound of the Nile flows on, perhaps carrying microscopic amounts of arsenic that have been absorbed through your now compromised skin barrier. For the best results, we should repeat this every 10 days, Nefertari advises as she moves on to your legs. Though most only manage once a month when the moon is full. The constant background murmur of the river continues as you contemplate the cumulative arsenic exposure this regular practice entails. Over a lifetime, an Egyptian might undergo hundreds of these procedures, gradually accumulating toxic metals in their system. The health effects, digestive disorders, nerve damage, organ failure, would be attributed to displeased gods or malevolent spirits, rather than beauty practices. For more sensitive areas, face, underarms, and intimate regions, Nefertari recommends the less traumatic but more painful honey method. This primitive form of waxing uses honey mixed with sugar, heated to a sticky consistency, applied to the skin, and then ripped away along with the unwanted hair. The sound of the Nile provides little comfort as you experience this ancient torture, your yelp joining a chorus of similar sounds from others undergoing the same procedure. The priests of Amun remove all body hair every second day, mentions an older woman who has already completed her depilation. They consider even a single hair an impurity that offends the gods. This extreme approach to hairlessness wasn't merely aesthetic but deeply religious. Purity rituals demanded smooth skin, especially for those who served in temples. The eternal flow of the Nile seems to embody this concept of purification, washing away impurities just as the depilation removes unwanted hair. Different social classes approached body hair removal with varying degrees of thoroughness. The elite might employ servants whose sole job was to keep their masters hairless, using fine copper tweezers to remove any stray hairs missed by chemical depilatories. Working-class Egyptians typically focused on visible areas and treated themselves less frequently. The poorest might resort to pumice stones or rough cloths to abrade away hair, less effective but also less likely to cause arsenic poisoning. The sound of the great river continues, democratic in its flow past the elaborate bathing chambers of palaces and the simple reed huts of farmers alike. For those who couldn't tolerate the arsenic paste or afford the honey method, there was a third option, shaving with sharp bronze razors. This required frequent repetition as it only removed hair at the surface, and the blades quickly dulled, making the process increasingly uncomfortable. The constant murmur of the Nile accompanies the scrape of bronze against skin, a sound that makes modern people wince at the thought of shaving without soap or proper razors. After your depilation is complete, Nefertari applies a soothing paste of aloe vera and natron to reduce inflammation. Keep out of the sun for a day, she advises. The skin needs time to recover. Indeed, freshly depilated skin is particularly vulnerable to Egypt's harsh sunlight, another health trade-off in the pursuit of the cultural ideal. The eternal sound of the Nile flows on as you examine your now hairless limbs. Red and irritated but culturally acceptable. Now completely depilated, poisoned, and oil-slicked. You're one step closer to the Egyptian beauty ideal. Your irritated skin is probably crying out for mercy, but at least you're socially presentable and relatively parasite-free. For now. The ceaseless flow of the Nile continues, reminding that, like the river always returns to flood, your hair will inevitably return, demanding another round of this painful ritual in the name of hygiene. The constant sound of the Nile continues its eternal flow as you prepare for an entirely different category of Egyptian hygiene: ritual purification. Because standard bathing is one thing, scrubbing with natron and sand is unpleasant but straightforward. Sacred bathing, however, elevates cleanliness to a communion with the divine, complete with specific prayers, precise timing, and the ever-present risk of becoming a crocodile's breakfast in the name of spiritual purity. The priest has announced a purification ceremony at dawn tomorrow, explains your neighbor excitedly as you gather at the communal well. The Nile is at perfect height, not too high to be dangerous, not too low to be impure. The background murmur of the great river seems to acknowledge this assessment as other villagers join the conversation, discussing preparations for this significant event. Ritual bathing in ancient Egypt isn't merely about physical cleanliness. It's a complex religious practice connecting worshippers to the divine cycle of death and rebirth symbolized by the Nile's annual flooding. The constant sound of the river serves as a reminder of this eternal cycle as you prepare your offerings for tomorrow's ceremony. Wear white linen if you have it, advises an elderly woman who has participated in countless such rituals, and bring lotus flowers if you can afford them. The blue lotus opens with the morning sun. It symbolizes Ra's rebirth from the primordial waters. The eternal flow of the Nile continues as you mentally inventory your possessions, wondering if you can trade something for a few precious lotus blossoms at the market. Dawn arrives with the river mist rising like spirits from the Nile's surface. You join a procession of villagers making their way to a specifically designated section of the riverbank, a place considered particularly sacred due to its alignment with a nearby shrine. The temple priests have arrived before you, marking the safe area with reed posts and flags. The constant sound of the flowing water seems almost musical in the early morning stillness. Stay within the marked area, cautions a temple attendant as the crowd gathers at the riverbank. We checked for crocodiles at first light, but they move quickly. This practical safety measure is seamlessly integrated with religious significance. Crocodiles are associated with the god Sobek, who must be respected but preferably avoided during human purification rituals. The eternal murmur of the Nile continues as you eye the water somewhat nervously, wondering if Sobek is feeling particularly hunger or holiness-oriented today. The ceremony begins with the head priest raising his arms toward the rising sun, his voice rising above the constant sound of the river. Hail to you, Ra, who emerges from the waters. Hail to you, Khepri, who becomes in the morning. Hail to you, Hapi, who brings the blessed inundation. The assembled crowd responds with practiced phrases, the call and response creating a rhythm that complements the flowing sound of the Nile. Unlike your regular utilitarian bathing, ritual purification follows precise steps. First, you must symbolically cast away impurities by throwing a small clay figurine representing negative aspects into the river. Focus your disappointing harvest yields, your quarrels with your spouse, your bitter thoughts into the figurine, instructs a junior priest moving among the crowd. The Nile will dissolve them and transform them. The constant sound of the great river seems to promise this spiritual alchemy, as dozens of small clay pieces arc through the air and plop into the water. Next comes the actual immersion. Men and women separate into different sections, not from modesty. Egyptians are relatively unbothered by nudity in same-gender groups, but for ritual reasons. The eternal flow of the Nile continues as you disrobe, folding your simple linen garment carefully on the shore. Submerge yourself exactly 7 times, instructs the priest. Count slowly with each immersion. With each emergence from the water, you are symbolically reborn. The constant background sound of the river accompanies this ritual counting as you dip beneath the surface repeatedly. The cool water feels pleasant in the already warming morning air, though you remain vigilantly alert for any suspicious movements beneath the surface. A particular detail that would surprise many modern observers: these ritual baths often included the consumption of small amounts of Nile water. Yes, the same water we've established is teeming with bacteria, parasites, and dissolved contaminants. A special silver cup is passed among participants, each taking a ritual sip. "The water of life strengthens your ka," declares the priest as you reluctantly take your turn. The eternal sound of the Nile seems almost amused as you try to take the smallest possible sip, while still appearing devoutly enthusiastic. After emerging from your 7th submersion, attendants offer natron powder to rub on your skin, not for cleaning this time, but as a spiritual purifier associated with the divine. The white powder represents Ma'at, truth, balance, and cosmic order, explains a temple scribe to some children participating in their first ritual. The constant murmur of the Great River provides a soothing backdrop to this educational moment. Historical records indicate these purification rituals weren't merely superstition, but served important psychological and social functions. They marked seasonal transitions, reinforced community bonds, and provided a shared spiritual experience that transcended social classes. The eternal flow of the Nile witnesses pharaoh and peasant alike performing similar rituals, though obviously with drastically different levels of elaboration and comfort. "Now we receive the blessing of lotus," announces the head priest as attendants distribute blue lotus flowers to the participants. You're fortunate to have traded a small jar of honey for 3 precious blossoms at considerable expense. The constant sound of the river complements the priest's instructions. Crush the flower lightly and anoint your forehead, heart, and hands with its essence. What isn't mentioned explicitly, though everyone knows, is that the blue lotus contains mild psychoactive compounds that induce a sense of tranquility and well-being when absorbed through the skin or inhaled. The ritual purification thus includes a subtle pharmaceutical element that enhances the spiritual experience. The eternal murmur of the Nile seems to deepen and enrich as the lotus compounds begin to affect your perception. The ceremony concludes with an offering of incense to Hapi, god of the Nile flood, and Anuket, goddess of the river itself. The constant sound of the flowing water merges with the rhythmic chanting as smoke rises toward the brightening sky. You feel genuinely refreshed, spiritually uplifted, and impressively clean, although objectively, you're probably hosting several new parasitic hitchhikers from your ritual immersion. As you dress in your cleanest linen garment, your newly purified state demands appropriate scenting. After all, what use is ritual purity if you don't smell divine as well? The eternal flow of the Nile continues as you prepare to enhance your freshly baptized body, with fragrances potent enough to make the gods themselves take notice. Whether from delight or self-defense remains an open theological question. The eternal sound of the Nile continues its steady flow as you progress to what might be the most aromatic aspect of Egyptian hygiene: perfuming. Having been ritually purified, now comes the social necessity of ensuring you don't merely appear clean, but absolutely radiate fragrance. In the land of the pharaohs, subtle is not a concept applied to scents. Egyptian perfumes are designed to announce your presence to everyone within substantial radius, competing successfully with the ever-present aromas of livestock, urban crowding, and the organic richness of the Nile itself. "Ah, perfect timing," exclaims Amenemhat, a local perfumer whose small workshop operates near the temple district. "I've just completed a fresh batch of Imperial Lotus Blend." The constant murmur of the Nile provides acoustic background as you enter his aromatic domain, a small mud brick structure where the air is so heavily saturated with competing scents that first-time visitors often need a moment to adjust before they can breathe normally. The workshop contains dozens of containers: alabaster jars with tight-fitting lids for precious finished products, open ceramic vessels where materials macerate in oils, copper pots for heating blends, and stone mortars for grinding raw ingredients. The eternal sound of the river flows outside as Amenemhat guides you through his current inventory. "For someone of your standing, I recommend this blend," he suggests, uncorking a slender alabaster bottle. The aroma that erupts is so potent it seems almost visible, a complex symphony of lotus flower, myrrh, cinnamon, and honey, underpinned with something distinctly resinous. The constant background sound of the Nile seems momentarily overpowered by this olfactory assault. This contains 14 distinct ingredients, Amenemhat says proudly. The base is bolanos oil infused with blue lotus flowers harvested at dawn. Then I add imported cinnamon and cardamom from lands far to the east, frankincense and myrrh from Punt, local honey that's been fermented with dates, and a special resin collected from trees that grow only at the first cataract. The perfumer's detailed explanation continues as the eternal flow of the Nile provides rhythmic accompaniment outside. Egyptian perfumes weren't simple fragrances, but complex formulations with specific ingredients chosen for symbolic, religious, and medicinal properties, as well as their scents. Some formulas were so valued, they were inscribed on temple walls alongside sacred texts. This is kifi, Amenemhat explains, showing you a dark, resinous mixture in a special gold-lined container, reserved primarily for temple use. 16 precise ingredients in exact proportions. It's burned during evening rituals to honor Ra's journey through the underworld. The constant sound of the great river seems appropriate accompaniment to this sacred substance that connects terrestrial and divine realms. Egyptologists have actually reconstructed kaifi using temple recipes, discovering it contains juniper berries, wine, honey, raisins, various resins, and numerous herbs. The complexity of these ancient perfume formulations reveals a sophisticated understanding of how different aromatics interact and evolve over time. The eternal murmur of the Nile flows on, witness to this ancient aromatic alchemy. For daily wear, most people prefer something simpler, the perfumer acknowledges, showing you a more modest ceramic container. This is our popular Nile lotus blend, moringa oil infused with white lotus, a touch of frankincense, and local herbs. Appropriate for a merchant or skilled artisan. The sound of the river seems almost to recognize itself in this namesake fragrance, as you sample its more restrained, though still potent by modern standards, aroma. The social hierarchies of Egyptian society were reflected in perfume access and usage. Royalty and high priests used blends containing rare imported ingredients, sometimes with precious materials like gold dust added for extra divine connection. The middle classes used simpler but still carefully crafted fragrances, while the poorest Egyptians might use bundles of local herbs or flower garlands. The constant flow of the Nile witnesses all these distinctions as it passes palace gardens and humble village dwellings alike. Now, how would you like to apply your perfume? Asks Amenemhat. I offer traditional oil application, scented linen bands, or for special occasions, a fragrance cone. The eternal sound of the river continues as you consider these options, each with different social signaling and practical implications. The most intriguing option, the fragrance cone, represents a uniquely Egyptian approach to perfuming that would baffle modern sensibilities. These conical structures made of scented fats were designed to be worn on the head during banquets and special events. As the warm, ambient temperature slowly melted the cone, the scented fat would gradually drip down, covering the wearer in fragrant oil while simultaneously broadcasting status and refinement. The constant murmur of the Nile flows steadily as you try to imagine the practical challenges of conversation while wearing what amounts to a melting candle on your head. The palace officials have recently started using dual-scented cones, mentions Amenemhat's assistant, who's been grinding ingredients in the corner. Lotus scent on the upper half, gradually transitioning to myrrh at the base. As it melts, the fragrance evolves throughout the evening. This innovation represents the height of Egyptian fragrance technology, an ancient version of the modern perfume concept of top notes, heart notes, and base notes changing over time. The eternal sound of the great river accompanies these evolving scent profiles, itself unchanging while all else transforms. For temple purification tomorrow, I recommend the oil application and scented linen bands for your wrists, advises Amenemhat. Cones are more appropriate for celebrations, not solemn worship. The sound of the Nile continues its steady flow as he selects an appropriate blend from his collection and begins the application process. The perfumer dips a wooden applicator into the fragrant oil and dabs it strategically, behind ears, on wrists, at the throat, behind knees, and at the elbows. These are the warming points of the body, he explains. The heat activates the scent throughout the day. The constant background murmur of the river provides counterpoint to his expert movements. Beyond mere pleasant aromas, Egyptian perfumes served religious, medicinal, and protective functions. Certain scents were believed to repel evil spirits or specific diseases. Others were thought to please particular deities or enhance specific prayers. Some blends were even ingested as remedies for internal ailments, a practice with obvious health risks given the potent essential oils and resins involved. The eternal flow of the Nile, source of life and constant companion to Egyptian civilization, seems to approve of these multiple layers of purpose. "There," announces Amenemhat, after thoroughly anointing you with fragrant oils and tying scented linen bands around your wrists. Now you're properly prepared for both divine and human company. As you exit his workshop, trailing an aromatic cloud that will announce your presence long before you're visible, the constant sound of the Nile seems almost muted in comparison to your olfactory presence. Thoroughly perfumed, you're now a walking advertisement for Egyptian concepts of cleanliness and status, oil-slicked, hairless, made up and scented to an intensity that would cause modern sensitivity reactions. But by local standards, you're the pinnacle of hygiene and refinement. The eternal murmur of the great river continues, accompanying your fragrant progress through the streets where people turn to notice your approach, sometimes with appreciation, sometimes with watering eyes. The eternal sound of the Nile continues its unwavering flow as we approach a subject that rarely appears in hieroglyphic records, but occupies a significant portion of daily life, answering nature's call. Where and how ancient Egyptians managed their biological necessities reveals much about their practical ingenuity, social stratification, and the ever-present influence of the great river whose sound forms the constant backdrop to Egyptian existence. "Mind your step along this path," cautions an elderly neighbor as you walk together toward the settlement's edge. The designated elimination area is just beyond those palms. The constant murmur of the Nile seems to grow slightly louder as you approach what serves as the communal toilet facility for your neighborhood, essentially an assigned section of land near, but not directly beside, the river. Unlike the romantic images portrayed in films about ancient Egypt, the reality of waste management was decidedly unglamorous. For the vast majority of Egyptians, bathroom facilities consisted of designated outdoor areas, convenient ditches, or simply the great outdoors. The eternal sound of the flowing river provided background music to these most basic human functions. The nobles have special rooms with limestone seats in their villas, your companion explains with a hint of envy. A servant empties the collection pots afterward. This early version of the private bathroom was indeed a luxury reserved for the wealthy. Archaeological excavations have uncovered these primitive toilets in higher status homes, typically a limestone or wooden seat positioned over a ceramic vessel or sand-filled box. The constant sound of the Nile flows on, indifferent to these class distinctions in waste management. For the pharaoh and highest nobility, facilities were more elaborate. Some royal palaces featured dedicated toilet chambers, with seats carved from limestone, sometimes even depicting lions or other sacred animals whose bodies formed the seat. Drainage systems using water to carry waste away have been found in a few elite residences near the royal compounds. The eternal murmur of the great river continues, perhaps carrying away the evidence of these early sanitation innovations. When traveling, the scribes carry small portable seats and screens for privacy, mentions your companion. "I saw a tax collection expedition once. They had 5 donkeys just carrying their toilet equipment." This detail reveals how fundamental aspects of hygiene created entire categories of specialized equipment and professional roles in Egyptian society. The constant sound of the Nile flows steadily as you consider how something as universal as elimination becomes elaborately stratified in complex civilizations. What about cleaning afterward? This delicate subject reveals further ingenuity. Wealthy Egyptians used soft linen cloths, while those of more modest means might use papyrus sheets, smooth plant leaves, or handfuls of rushes. The poorest simply used what was always available: sand, nature's abrasive but abundant cleansing material. The eternal flow of the river continues as you contemplate how something modern people take entirely for granted required such varied improvisations. "Be careful not after dark," warns your elderly guide. "Scorpions and snakes favor warm elimination sites." This practical hazard led to the development of protective practices and even religious associations. The goddess Meretsiger was specifically invoked for protection against venomous creatures that might be lurking in toilet areas, a divine specialist in bathroom safety. The constant background murmur of the Nile seems almost to emphasize the importance of this warning. Many an Egyptian met an undignified end from a scorpion's sting in a highly vulnerable moment. For urban dwellings without access to private facilities, archaeological evidence suggests communal elimination areas existed at settlement edges. Some ruins show evidence of designated streets or alleys that likely served as community toilets, the ancient equivalent of public restrooms, though without the actual rooms. The eternal sound of the river flows on, eventually receiving much of this waste through groundwater or direct dumping. The soldiers on campaign dig trenches downwind from their camps, offers a former military scribe who joins your conversation. The commander's tents are always positioned upwind, of course. This practical military sanitation reveals an intuitive understanding of disease prevention, even without germ theory. The constant sound of the Nile continues as you learn how waste management shaped even military strategy and camp layouts. A fascinating aspect of Egyptian attitudes toward elimination was its integration into medical practice. Physicians regularly examined excrement for diagnostic purposes, with medical papyri containing detailed descriptions of what constituted healthy versus concerning waste products. Different colors, consistencies, and even odors were carefully categorized as indicators of specific health conditions. The eternal murmur of the great river provides a soothing counterpoint to this rather unsavory medical discussion. The temple physicians keep sealed pots of waste from important patients, explains the scribe, lowering his voice. They believe repeated examination reveals the progression of illness or healing. This practice, though seemingly primitive, represents an early form of medical monitoring that modern doctors would recognize as fundamentally sound, if unhygienically executed. The constant sound of the Nile flows on, witness to these early attempts at systematic healthcare. For women, management of menstruation added additional hygiene challenges. Linen cloths similar to those used for bandages were employed, secured with narrow belts or ties. These had to be washed and reused, typically in the Nile, whose sound continues its eternal backdrop to these practical necessities. The scarcity and value of fabric meant that even these intimate items were carefully maintained and recycled until literally falling apart. The priests have special purification rituals after elimination, the scribe mentions. They must wash with natron and recite specific prayers before returning to temple duties. This connection between physical elimination and ritual impurity exists across many ancient cultures, reflecting intuitive understanding of waste as potentially dangerous or contaminating. The eternal sound of the river flows on, itself considered a purifying force that could wash away both physical and spiritual impurities. Perhaps the most surprising aspect of ancient Egyptian toilet habits was the practical recycling of human waste. In a society where nothing was wasted, excrement served as fertilizer for fields, fuel when dried, in areas where wood was scarce, and even as a component in certain industrial processes like leatherworking. The constant murmur of the Nile provides continuous background to this surprisingly sophisticated circular economy. The best fertilizer comes from the dove keepers' compounds, says a farmer who's joined your growing conversational circle. They collect both bird and human waste together, makes the barley grow twice as tall. This practical agricultural knowledge represents generations of observation and experimentation, creating effective farming practices without scientific understanding of nitrogen cycles or soil chemistry. The eternal sound of the great river continues, bringing its own gift of fertile silt to complement these human contributions. As you consider the entirety of Egyptian elimination practices, from the pharaoh's ornate limestone toilet seats to the humble communal ditches, you're struck by how something so universal reveals the same social stratification, practical ingenuity, and religious integration that characterizes every aspect of life along the Nile. The constant sound of the river flows on, perhaps the most democratic element in Egyptian society, receiving waste from commoner and king alike, and carrying it away with the same indifferent current. The eternal sound of the Nile continues its steady flow, as we delve into what might be the most personally invasive aspect of Egyptian hygiene, the management of internal parasites. Because while external cleanliness received elaborate attention, the interior landscape of the Egyptian body hosted its own teeming ecosystem of unwelcome residents. In a civilization without microscopes, antibiotics, or even a basic understanding of microorganisms, cohabitation with intestinal guests was simply an accepted fact of existence. "My stomach troubles me again," confides Nacht, a middle-aged scribe who's seeking guidance from Pensekmet, a respected local healer. The constant murmur of the Nile provides soothing background as several patients wait their turn outside the healer's modest dwelling. The pain comes after eating, and my strength diminishes despite good food. Pensekmet nods knowingly. He's heard these symptoms countless times. Your body hosts the coiled snake, he diagnoses confidently. It steals your nourishment before your ka can receive it. What modern medicine would identify as a tapeworm infection is, to the ancient Egyptian, a semi-mystical internal predator that must be driven out through a combination of physical and spiritual interventions. The eternal sound of the river flows on, indifferent to the microscopic battles being waged within human intestines on its banks. I have prepared the traveler's remedy, says Pensekmet, retrieving a sealed pottery jar from a recessed shelf. Pomegranate rind and wormwood steeped in beer for 7 days, with prayers to Sekhmet spoken at each sunrise. The constant background murmur of the Nile seems to emphasize the healer's measured words as he dispenses his medicine. Remarkably, this remedy wasn't entirely superstition. Modern research has confirmed that pomegranate contains alkaloids with genuine anthelmintic, anti-worm properties. The Egyptians stumbled upon effective treatments through generations of trial and error, even without understanding the true nature of parasitic infections. The eternal flow of the river continues as you witness this blend of practical pharmacology and spiritual healing, a hallmark of Egyptian medicine. Drink half at sunset, half at sunrise, instructs Pensekmet. Then eat nothing until your body expels the invader. When the coiled one emerges, burn it immediately while speaking this protection charm. He hands over a small papyrus scrap with hieratic writing, a specialized spell for preventing the expelled parasite from returning. The sound of the Nile flows continuously as Nacht accepts these instructions with appropriate gravity. Archaeological evidence confirms that parasitic infections were nearly universal in ancient Egypt. Microscopic examination of mummified remains reveals eggs from various intestinal worms preserved for millennia. Even high-status individuals, including pharaohs, show evidence of these infections, proof that wealth and power provided little protection against microscopic invaders. The constant murmur of the great river continues, perhaps itself the primary vector for many of these parasites. For children with the swollen belly sickness, I recommend the bitter fruit paste, Pensekmet tells a worried mother who's next in line. He's describing what modern medicine would recognize as ascariasis, a roundworm infection that causes distended abdomens, particularly in children. His bitter fruit paste contains extracts from several plants with natural antiparasitic properties. The eternal sound of the Nile provides rhythmic accompaniment to these medical consultations that blend empirical observation with magical thinking. A fascinating aspect of Egyptian parasite management was the recognition of different types of intestinal worms. They distinguished between at least 3 varieties based on symptoms and appearance when expelled. The Edwin Smith and Ebers medical papyri contain detailed descriptions of these parasites and recommended treatments. The constant background sound of the river flows on as Pensekmet demonstrates this diagnostic knowledge, accumulated over generations. The thin white thread worms require different treatment than the flat ribbon worms, he explains to an apprentice who's observing the consultations. For the thread type, garlic and coriander seed paste for 3 days. For the ribbon type, pomegranate rind and thyme. This surprisingly sophisticated differentiation between pinworms and tapeworms reveals careful observation and categorization of parasitic infections. The eternal murmur of the Nile continues as this medical knowledge is transferred to the next generation. For particularly stubborn infections, Egyptian healers prescribed more aggressive purgatives, essentially potent laxatives to physically expel the parasites. A favorite was castor oil, often mixed with beer to mask its repulsive taste, unsuccessfully by most accounts. The effectiveness of this approach was based less on specific anti-parasitic action and more on creating an intestinal environment so hostile that even the worms wanted to leave. The sound of the great river flows steadily on, perhaps symbolizing the desired evacuation. My sister's son took the strong purging medicine last month, comments a patient waiting his turn. He sat in the elimination area for 2 full days, but when it was over, he passed a worm as long as my arm. Murmurs of impressed disgust ripple through the waiting area as the constant sound of the Nile continues its eternal flow, unconcerned with these human dramas. Some treatments were surprisingly sophisticated. The Eber's papyrus describes a remedy for worms that eat the belly, a mixture of various medicinal plants taken for 3 days, followed by a strong purgative on the 4th day. The patient would then lie on a set of heated bricks covered with cloths, sweating profusely, essentially creating an artificial fever that, we now know, can indeed help the body fight certain parasites. The eternal sound of the river provides continuous background to these medical innovations developed through centuries of careful observation. Prevention, however, was virtually non-existent due to lack of understanding about how parasites were transmitted. Egyptians made no connection between drinking unfiltered Nile water, whose sound remains a constant presence, and contracting parasites. They didn't recognize that inadequately cooked fish or meat served as sources of tapeworms. The concept of washing hands after defecation to prevent the spread of parasite eggs would have seemed magical thinking rather than practical hygiene. Some worms are natural to the body, theorizes Pensekmet to his increasingly educated audience. They become problematic only when they multiply beyond their proper number, or when foreign worms enter from outside. This concept of a proper balance of internal fauna isn't entirely unlike modern understanding of gut microbiomes, though with significant scientific limitations. The constant murmur of the Nile continues as these early medical theories are developed and shared. Perhaps most intriguing is that some Egyptian medical texts differentiate between beneficial and harmful internal worms. Modern research into the hygiene hypothesis suggests that certain parasitic infections might actually modulate the immune system in ways that prevent autoimmune disorders. Could the Egyptians have inadvertently observed this phenomenon? The eternal flow of the river continues, carrying away certainties and leaving questions that span millennia. For the average Egyptian, living with periodic parasitic infections was simply part of existence, as inevitable as the sound of the Nile that forms the constant backdrop to life. You learn to recognize the symptoms, to use traditional remedies when things got particularly bad, and to simply continue with your life when the infestation was at an acceptable level. In an era without microscopes to reveal the true nature of these afflictions, most people simply assumed that occasional abdominal pains and fatigue were normal aspects of the human condition. As Pensekmet concludes his day of consultations, dispensing remedies and charms against intestinal invaders, the eternal murmur of the Nile continues, a reminder that life proceeds along its course, with or without unwanted internal guests. At least, unlike head lice, these parasites aren't visible to your neighbors, small blessings in a world where modern hygiene remains an unimaginable dream. The eternal sound of the Nile continues its steady flow, but competing with this tranquil soundtrack is another, more irritating sound, the incessant buzzing of insects. Because what would ancient Egyptian hygiene be without the constant battle against an airborne army that views you as either a convenient landing pad, a walking buffet, or both? In a land where the life-giving river creates perfect breeding conditions for every six-legged tormentor imaginable, insect management becomes as routine as breathing, and occasionally prevents it. "These blessed flies!" exclaims Imhotep, a middle-aged artisan attempting to work on a delicate piece of jewelry, while simultaneously swatting at the air around his face. "I've killed 20 already this morning, and 20 more appear." The constant murmur of the Nile flows through the open workshop windows, accompanied by the distinctive high-pitched whine of mosquitoes seeking their next meal. The common house fly represents the most numerous and persistent enemy in the daily Egyptian battle for hygiene. These ubiquitous insects are everywhere, landing on your food, your eyes, your wounds, your waste, and then returning to your food again, creating a cycle of contamination that would horrify modern microbiologists. The eternal sound of the river continues, almost drowned out at times by the collective buzzing of these tiny disease vectors. "Try this," offers Nefret, a neighbor who stopped by with a large palm leaf fan. "My husband traded with a Nubian merchant for it last market day. The handle is carved hippopotamus tusk." The constant background murmur of the Nile provides counterpoint to the rhythmic swooshing of the fan, as Imhotep gratefully accepts this weapon in the eternal war against flying pests. Fans weren't merely luxury items in ancient Egypt. They were essential hygiene tools. Made from ostrich feathers, palm leaves, or papyrus, these objects were as indispensable as water jars. In wealthy households, Servants had the sole function of continuously fanning their masters, not just for cooling, but primarily to keep insects at bay. The eternal flow of the Great River continues outside as Nefret demonstrates the proper wrist technique for maximum insect-repelling efficiency. The temple priests use special silver fans during rituals, she explains. They say flies are manifestations of chaos that must be kept away from sacred spaces. This religious dimension to pest control reflects how thoroughly insects penetrated every aspect of Egyptian life, including theology. The constant sound of the Nile seems momentarily overshadowed by the spiritual significance of insect management. Egyptian ingenuity developed remarkable variety in insect repellents, with effectiveness ranging from completely useless to marginally useful in perfect conditions. A common formulation involved animal fat infused with aromatic herbs such as mint, rosemary, and juniper. Applied to the skin, it supposedly deterred insects. In practice, it probably just made you smell different while continuing to be bitten. The eternal murmur of the river flows on, indifferent to these largely futile human innovations. During the last inundation season, I tried the crocodile fat mixture, shares Imhotep, still fanning vigorously. Mixed with crushed lotus petals and cedar oil, kept the flies away for perhaps an hour, but attracted every cat in the neighborhood. His workshop companions laugh knowingly. The constant background sound of the Nile continues through this exchange of experimental pest control methods. Historians continue to debate the efficacy of some Egyptian repellents. One papyrus mentions a mixture of moringa, juniper, and coriander seeds boiled in wine and applied to the body. Modern research suggests some of these ingredients do contain compounds with mild insect-repelling properties. The eternal flow of the Great River continues as Egyptians experiment with botanical solutions to their relentless six-legged tormentors. Last summer, a merchant from the eastern desert sold my brother mineral earth that supposedly repels mosquitoes, offers a workshop apprentice. He rubbed it all over his body before sleeping. Didn't work for mosquitoes, but his wife refused to sleep beside him for a week. This practical failure highlights the desperation for effective solutions. The constant sound of the Nile flows on, providing ideal breeding grounds for the very insects Egyptians struggled to repel. A surprisingly common method was simply covering oneself with Nile mud. This technique, still used by some African tribes today, creates a physical barrier that insects have difficulty penetrating. Effective? Reasonably. Comfortable? Not remotely. Elegant? Only if your definition of elegance includes resembling a walking clay statue. The eternal murmur of the river continues, seemingly offering both the problem and a partial solution. During the high mosquito season, my entire family sleeps under linen sheets hanging from the ceiling, explains Nefret. The temple artisans weave them with extra fine threads that even the smallest biters cannot penetrate. These primitive bed nets offer genuine protection, though at the cost of sweltering discomfort in Egypt's hot climate. The constant background sound of the Great River provides accompaniment to these nighttime struggles against flying tormentors. A fascinating cultural detail. Egyptians developed specific protective amulets against insects, particularly scorpions and centipedes. Small figurines of the dwarf god Bes were especially popular for this purpose, placed strategically at home entrances or worn as personal protections. The eternal flow of the Nile continues outside as Imhotep shows off the Bes amulet he wears during mosquito season, insisting its magical efficacy outweighs its questionable aesthetic appeal on a grown man. Mosquitoes presented perhaps the greatest insect threat, particularly near the marshy areas of the Nile Delta. Beyond their irritating bites, they were vectors for malaria, a disease Egyptians knew intimately, even without understanding its cause. Medical papyri describe recurring fevers with chills that perfectly match malaria symptoms. Some mummies contain genetic evidence of malaria parasites, confirming the disease's presence. The constant sound of the river flows on, creating the perfect breeding environment for these dangerous insects. My cousin in the northern delta burns cattle dung through the night to keep mosquitoes away, shares another workshop visitor. The smoke drives them away, though it nearly suffocates the family too. This common practice, burning various substances to create insect-repelling smoke, was effective, but created its own health problems. Respiratory issues from constant smoke inhalation were a price many considered worth paying to avoid being devoured by insects. The eternal murmur of the Nile continues, indifferent to these difficult trade-offs. For wealthy Egyptians, another solution to the insect problem was architectural. Houses designed with high sleeping quarters accessed by ladders that could be removed at night. Insects, particularly scorpions and other crawling threats, couldn't reach the sleeping family. Some elite homes even had specialized cooling rooms with ventilation shafts designed to create air movement that discouraged flying insects. The constant sound of the river flows steadily outside these carefully designed spaces that attempted to create insect-free zones for the privileged few. The pharaoh's bedchamber is said to have gold mesh screens at the windows, remarks Imhotep with something between skepticism and awe. And servants stand guard through the night, watching for any insect that dares approach the divine body. While likely exaggerated, royal insect protection was indeed elaborate, with specialized servants and equipment dedicated solely to keeping the royal person bite-free. The eternal flow of the great river continues, democratic in supplying insects to both royal and common dwellings alike. Lice and fleas were so common they were practically considered companion animals rather than pests. Remember that part about shaving all body hair and wearing wigs? It wasn't just for style, it was desperate pragmatism. Head lice were so ubiquitous that eliminating their habitat entirely was the only truly effective solution. The constant murmur of the Nile provides background to this perpetual battle against tiny parasitic invaders. My daughter serves in a noble household, shares Nefret with quiet pride. They have 3 cats specifically trained to hunt rats and mice. These feline pest controllers weren't merely pets, but essential household staff. Egyptians didn't worship cats solely for mystical reasons. They venerated them for their practical role in controlling rodents, and by extension, the fleas these rodents carried. The eternal sound of the river flows on outside as the visitors discuss the proper feeding and training of efficient hunter cats. In the end, the Egyptian battle against insects was a war of attrition that humans were destined to lose. For every fly swatted, 10 more appeared. For every mosquito avoided, 100 more hatched in the life-giving waters of the Nile. The best strategy was a combination of stoic acceptance and creative adaptation. Continuous fanning, strategic smoking, physical barriers, and the occasional desperate coating of mud. The eternal flow of the great river continues, as does its generous provision of insect life that has tormented humans along its banks for millennia. The eternal sound of the Nile continues its steady flow as we turn to another essential aspect of Egyptian hygiene, the laundering of garments. After slathering your body with oils, cosmetics, and perfumes that would make a modern chemical hazard team nervous, you inevitably transfer these substances to your clothing, creating textiles that are stained, malodorous, and distressingly sticky. Addressing this problem without modern detergents, washing machines, or even running water becomes yet another hygienic challenge in the shadow of the pyramids. It's the monthly washing day, announces your household's matriarch as she organizes an expedition to the riverbank. Gather all the linens, bedding, garments, everything. The constant murmur of the Nile grows louder as your family group approaches its banks, carrying bundles of soiled fabric and the necessary cleaning implements. Other families have had the same idea, creating a social gathering along the shore. Women, primarily, though some men participate, kneel at the water's edge, pounding fabrics against smooth rocks and sharing news and gossip. The eternal sound of the river mingles with human voices, laughter, splashing, and the rhythmic thwacking of linen against stone in a uniquely Egyptian symphony. Find a good flat rock, advises an experienced neighbor to a young bride attending her first communal washing. Not too rough to tear the fabric, not too smooth to be ineffective. The constant background sound of the flowing water continues as the women demonstrate various techniques: soaking, rubbing, beating, and rinsing, each designed for different types of stains and fabrics. While water alone might remove some dirt, the primary cleaning agent is our multi-purpose friend natron, that same alkaline substance used for everything from toothpaste to mummification. Mixed with water, it creates a primitive detergent that helps break down oils and organic materials. The eternal murmur of the great river seems almost to comment on how its waters are enhanced by this versatile mineral found in deposits throughout the Nile Valley. Be careful with the fine ceremonial linen, cautions an elderly woman supervising the younger workers. Too much natron weakens the fibers. dilute it more for delicate fabrics. Her wisdom comes from decades of experience, observing how harsh cleaning methods gradually destroy textiles. The constant sound of the Nile flows on, witness to generations of women balancing cleanliness against preservation of valuable fabrics. Archaeological evidence suggests the existence of professional laundering services in ancient Egypt. Specialized workers who cleaned garments and linens for temples, palaces, and wealthy households. The Edwin Smith Papyrus even mentions a keeper of the king's robes, who presumably supervised royal laundry operations. The eternal flow of the river continues past these early commercial establishments that might be considered the world's first dry cleaning businesses. Last month, the temple contracted 20 washers for the festival of Opet, mentions a woman whose cousin works in the Karnak complex. All the priests' garments, altar cloths, and ceremonial banners, hundreds of pieces that had to be purified according to specific rituals. The constant background murmur of the Nile provides accompaniment to this discussion of sacred laundering, where cleanliness becomes a religious obligation rather than merely a practical concern. The washing process is brutally harsh on fabrics. The combination of natron's alkalinity, vigorous pounding against stones, and extended exposure to sun bleaching gradually breaks down linen fibers. This explains why clothing was so valuable in ancient Egypt. It simply didn't last long under this aggressive cleaning regimen. The eternal sound of the river continues as you examine a garment showing signs of thinning and weakness along fold lines, casualties of repeated washings. For the whitest ceremonial robes, nothing works like camel urine, declares an older woman with absolute conviction. My grandmother was head laundress for the Temple of Thoth. She collected fresh urine each morning for the priest's finest garments. This practice, using urine as a bleaching agent, wasn't unique to Egypt, but was employed across the ancient world. The ammonia in fermented urine genuinely whitens fabrics. The constant sound of the flowing water seems almost to accelerate, as if trying to distance itself from this particular laundry secret. Specialized collection vessels for urine have been found by archaeologists, large pottery containers placed in public areas for donations that would later be used in textile processing. It's a glimpse into a surprisingly organized system of recycling bodily waste for practical purposes. The eternal murmur of the Nile continues, carrying away countless other hygiene secrets lost to history. After the washing comes the critical drying phase. Clean linens are spread over bushes, laid on warm rocks, or hung on ropes stretched between poles. The Egyptian sun does the work quickly, but proper placement is crucial. Angle fine garments away from the strongest midday sun, advises the elderly supervisor. Too direct, and the fibers become brittle. The constant background sound of the river provides counterpoint to these careful instructions for fabric preservation. Some fabrics receive additional treatment after drying, brushing with stiff palm fiber brushes to restore texture, pounding with wooden mallets to soften stiffness, and careful folding along established lines. The eternal flow of the great river continues as these finishing touches transform stiff, newly washed linen into comfortable, wearable garments once again. For elite households, the final stage involves scenting the garments, either by exposure to incense smoke or by storing them with aromatic herbs and flowers in sealed cedar chests. The royal perfumers create special scent sachets for the pharaoh's linens, shares a woman with court connections. Cinnamon, frankincense, and crushed lotus petals sewn into small linen pouches. The constant sound of the Nile flows on, indifferent to these status distinctions in laundry fragrance. A revealing detail about Egyptian laundry practices. The frequency of washing was much lower than modern standards would suggest. The process was so labor-intensive and damaging to fabrics that clothes were washed only when absolutely necessary. Generally, when the smell became socially unacceptable, even by the tolerant standards of the time. This explains partially the heavy use of perfumes and scented oils on the body. They helped mask the odor of garments that might go months between washings. The eternal murmur of the river continues. Witness to this practical compromise between cleanliness and conservation. Certain professions developed specialized cleaning techniques for their unique stains. Stonemasons for limestone dust, metal workers for oxide stains, butchers for blood, and scribes for ink. My husband uses natron mixed with crushed figs to remove copper stains from his workshop apron, shares one craftswoman. Works better than anything else we've tried. The constant background sound of the Nile accompanies this exchange of trade secrets passed through generations. As the day's laundering concludes, the clean, or cleaner, garments are carefully gathered and carried home. Tomorrow they'll be properly stored, folded, or hung depending on their type and importance. The eternal flow of the great river continues, having witnessed yet another cycle of the never-ending battle to maintain cleanliness in a dusty, oily, sweaty world without modern conveniences. Returning from the riverbank with your bundle of damp but clean linen, you reflect on how something as simple as clean clothing requires an entire day of hard physical labor, specialized knowledge passed through generations, and various caustic substances including, yes, urine. The constant sound of the Nile follows you home, a reminder that cleanliness in ancient Egypt is never simple, never complete, and never permanent. The eternal sound of the Nile continues its unwavering flow as we approach a hygiene challenge unique to approximately half the Egyptian population: the management of menstruation. In a civilization capable of building geometric marvels that would baffle engineers for millennia, the monthly biological reality faced by women required equally impressive ingenuity, albeit of a more practical and less monumental nature. "The moon cycle begins tomorrow," whispers Nefertari to her younger sister, carefully transferring a bundle of specially prepared linen strips from a cedar chest. "These are newly washed. I've prepared extra since the temple ceremony is scheduled for the third day." The constant murmur of the Nile provides gentle background to this private conversation between sisters, their voices kept low despite being alone in the women's quarters. Unlike some other ancient civilizations that developed elaborate taboos and restrictions around menstruating women, Egyptian culture maintained a relatively matter-of-fact approach to this biological process. The eternal flow of the river outside, with its own cycles of flood and recession, perhaps influenced this more balanced perspective. Natural rhythms were seen as part of life's ordered patterns, rather than mysterious occurrences requiring elaborate spiritual management. "Remember what Mother taught," continues Nefertari, demonstrating how to fold and position the linen strips. "The softest cloth goes against the body, then the absorbent middle layer, then the protective outer layer. This layered approach reveals sophisticated understanding of both comfort and functionality." The constant sound of the great river flows on, perhaps suggesting the source of inspiration for managing different types of flow. Archaeological evidence for menstrual management in ancient Egypt comes primarily from indirect sources: textile fragments, medical papyri, and fertility figurines rather than explicit descriptions. The eternal murmur of the Nile continues as archaeologists and historians piece together these fragments to understand this intimate aspect of ancient life that rarely appears in official records or monumental inscriptions. "The temple priestesses use red-dyed linen during their cycles," shares Nefertari, lowering her voice further though no one else is present. "They say it honors the blood of Isis that brings life to the land, just as the red waters of the Nile bring life during inundation." This connection between female cycles and the river's annual flooding represents a profound symbolic understanding of natural patterns. The constant background sound of the river seems almost to acknowledge this parallel as it continues its eternal flow. The primary menstrual management tool was the linen cloth, the same versatile material used for clothing, bandages, and nearly everything requiring fabric. Folded into absorbent pads and held in place with specialized belts or bands, these reusable cloths required regular washing and drying, creating additional laundry challenges we discussed earlier. The eternal sound of the Nile flows steadily on, the river itself being the washing facility for these intimate items. "When traveling, use these smaller pieces," advises Nefertari, showing specially sized cloths. "They dry faster when washed at river stops." The practical knowledge passed between generations of women created an oral tradition of menstrual management that left few written records but ensured effective techniques survived. The constant murmur of the great river provides counterpoint to these private teachings that flowed from mother to daughter across centuries. Historians continue to debate how frequently the average Egyptian woman actually menstruated. The combination of multiple pregnancies beginning at young ages, extended breastfeeding periods, and nutritional limitations likely resulted in fewer menstrual cycles than modern women experience. The eternal flow of the Nile continues outside, its reliable rhythms contrasting with the more variable patterns of female biology in ancient times. For cramping pain, The physician's wife recommends this warming pouch, says Nefertari, producing a small linen sachet filled with dried herbs. Heat it in the sun, then place it here. This approach to menstrual discomfort, using heat and herbal remedies, remains remarkably similar to methods still employed today. The constant sound of the river flows on, witness to therapeutic traditions that span millennia with little fundamental change. A fascinating aspect of Egyptian attitudes toward menstruation appears in their medical understanding. The Ebers Papyrus includes diagnostic tests that used menstrual blood to predict fertility and pregnancy outcomes. Far from being considered entirely taboo or unclean, it was recognized as having specific medical significance. The eternal murmur of the Nile provides background to these sophisticated medical traditions that integrated female biology into healthcare practices. The moon blood has power, Nefertari explains to her attentive sister. The temple healers use cloths from the first day of bleeding to draw out poisons from wounds. Never dispose of it carelessly. This medicinal application of menstrual blood, particularly for treating wounds and breast cysts, appears in several medical papyri. Modern research into the antimicrobial properties of menstrual blood suggests these applications weren't entirely without merit. The constant background sound of the river continues, carrying away centuries of medical knowledge lost and rediscovered. For tracking cycles, Egyptian women likely used the same lunar calendar that governed religious and agricultural life. The moon's phases provided a natural timekeeper that approximately matched menstrual intervals. Some evidence suggests women might have made small marks on pottery shards, ostraca, or papyrus scraps to monitor their personal patterns. The eternal flow of the great river continues outside, its annual flood cycle creating another natural calendar that structured Egyptian understanding of cyclical time. During heavy days, excuse yourself from weaving work, advises Nefertari. The overseer understands. Request water-carrying duty instead. This practical accommodation suggests some occupational flexibility existed for menstruating women, though certainly not modern concepts of menstrual leave. The constant sound of the Nile flows on, indifferent to these small human adaptations to biological realities. Elite women enjoyed significantly more comfort during menstruation, with finer linens, specially trained servant girls to assist with changing and washing cloths, and private spaces for rest if needed. Working-class women managed with coarser materials and without the luxury of reduced responsibilities. The eternal murmur of the river continues, democratic in its flow past both palace and village, yet witness to these disparities in managing identical biological processes. Some desert traders sell sea sponges that can be used instead of cloth, mentions Nefertari almost conspiratorially. Expensive, but convenient for festival days when dancing is expected. This reference to absorbent natural sponges used internally represents sophisticated understanding of alternative approaches to menstrual management. The constant background sound of the Nile seems almost to fade momentarily, replaced by the imagined sound of distant Red Sea waves where such sponges might be harvested. A significant cultural distinction. Unlike some other ancient societies, Egyptian religious practices generally didn't exclude menstruating women from sacred spaces or rituals. Some specific high ceremonies might require temporary abstention, but the general approach was notably practical rather than fearful or restrictive. The eternal flow of the great river continues outside, matching this acceptance of natural processes as simply part of life's expected patterns. As their conversation concludes, Nefertari carefully returns the remaining cloths to their cedar chest, covering them with fresh herbs to keep them pleasant-smelling until needed. The constant sound of the Nile follows the sisters as they resume their household duties. This aspect of feminine hygiene managed as efficiently as possible within the limitations of ancient technology. The river flows on, eternal and unchanging, while generations of women along its banks develop solutions to challenges that transcend time. The eternal sound of the Nile continues its unwavering flow as we reach the culmination of Egyptian hygiene practices, the comprehensive ritual of spiritual purification. Because after addressing the physical body in elaborate detail, from toxic cosmetics to arsenic hair removal to intestinal parasites, the ancient Egyptian understanding of true cleanliness ultimately transcends the physical to embrace the spiritual realm. The final, and perhaps most important aspect of being truly clean involves purifying the intangible self. The high priest has announced a ritual of renewal for the temple district, shares Amenhotep, an assistant scribe who serves at the shrine of Thoth. After the third hour tomorrow, those seeking complete purification should present themselves with appropriate offerings. The constant murmur of the great river provides serene backdrop to this announcement that ripples through the community, prompting immediate preparations. Unlike your regular hygiene practices or even the standard ritual bathing, a formal purification ceremony represents the pinnacle of Egyptian cleanliness, a comprehensive spiritual washing that prepares both body and soul for divine interaction. The eternal sound of the Nile flows continually as households begin selecting suitable offerings and preparing their finest linen garments for this significant occasion. "We must complete all physical cleansing today," explains the household elder, organizing family members into specific preparation tasks. No bathing, no scented oils, no food after sunset. The body must hunger for purification. These preparatory abstentions reflect the understanding that spiritual cleansing requires physical receptiveness. The constant background murmur of the river continues, its perpetual flow symbolizing the eternal nature of the purification being sought. Dawn arrives crisp and clear, with the first golden light illuminating the Nile's surface, as if the river itself is being spiritually transformed. Your household gathers, dressed in simple white linen, heads completely shaved and bodies entirely depilated. No impurity can be allowed to hide in even a single hair. The eternal sound of the flowing water accompanies your procession toward the temple district, joining streams of similarly prepared citizens, all seeking divine cleansing. "Remember the 7 sacred gestures," whispers your father as the temple comes into view. "Perform each precisely when instructed." These ritual movements, specific positions of hands, arms, and head, are believed to open the body to divine influences while simultaneously closing it to impure forces. The constant sound of the Nile continues as you mentally rehearse these sacred postures that must be executed perfectly for the purification to be effective. At the temple entrance, white-robed priests inspect each supplicant, turning away those with visible physical imperfections. A cut, a rash, even a noticeable insect bite might disqualify someone from participation. The eternal murmur of the great river flows on, indifferent to these human judgments of worthiness, as several disappointed citizens are directed to return after their blemishes heal. "You have prepared well," approves the examining priest, noting your flawless depilation and unblemished skin. "Proceed to the first gateway." Your heart quickens as you pass this initial assessment, the sound of the Nile seeming to accelerate with your pulse as you approach the ceremonial area where acacia incense creates clouds of purifying smoke. The purification ritual unfolds in carefully sequenced stages, each supervised by priests of increasing rank. First comes fumigation, standing with arms outstretched while attendants circle you with smoking censers of specific aromatic resins. The constant background sound of the river provides counterpoint to your measured breathing as you inhale the sacred smoke, visualizing it cleansing your interior spaces just as water cleanses your exterior. "Turn sunwise, slowly," instructs the priest, his shaved head gleaming in the morning light. "Receive the breath of Amun from all directions." You rotate gradually, feeling slightly dizzy from the potent incense as it envelops your body completely. The eternal flow of the Nile continues outside the temple walls, its persistent sound barely audible but psychologically present as you complete this initial purification stage. Next comes the water ritual, more elaborate than regular bathing or even standard religious ablutions. Specially collected Nile water, gathered during specific astronomical alignments and stored in sacred vessels, is poured over you in precise patterns, while prayers are chanted in perfect rhythm. The constant sound of the great river outside seems to harmonize with these ritual invocations as cool water cascades over your prepared body. "The water dissolves the boundary between worlds," intones the high priest, his voice carrying the authority of divine connection. "It carries away imperfection and creates space for perfection." This concept of purification as creating sacred emptiness, rather than merely removing impurity, represents sophisticated spiritual understanding. The eternal murmur of the Nile flows on, embodying this paradox of emptiness and fullness, absence and presence. Historical records describe these purification rituals in considerable detail. The Edwin Smith Papyrus and various temple inscriptions outline precise formulations for purification substances. specific natron sources, particular water collection points along the Nile, exact proportions of various incense components. The constant background sound of the river continues as you experience these meticulously developed protocols, refined over countless generations. After water purification comes anointing with consecrated oils, 7 sacred varieties applied to specific body points associated with divine energies. This is not for bodily perfume but for spiritual sealing, explains the anointing priest as he applies fragrant oil to your forehead, throat, heart, navel, and other specified locations. The eternal sound of the flowing water outside provides rhythmic accompaniment to this methodical application that creates what the Egyptians considered a protective energy barrier. Receive now the words of power, announces the high priest as you reach the innermost purification stage. These sacred utterances, believed to reorganize your spiritual essence when properly pronounced, must be repeated exactly as taught, with precise tonal qualities and breathing patterns. The constant sound of the Nile seems to recede as you focus completely on these sacred phonetic patterns passed down from the gods themselves. A particularly significant element of the purification ritual involves confession, not of actual transgressions, but rather their absence. I have not stolen, you recite from the formal negative confession. I have not killed. I have not wasted water. I have not spoken falsely. This fascinating approach to spiritual cleansing emphasizes affirming one's purity rather than acknowledging impurity. The eternal murmur of the great river flows on outside, witness to this ritual that fundamentally influenced later religious confession practices across multiple cultures. For the ritual's culmination, you receive the final mark of purification, a small emblem painted on your forehead with red ochre, identifying you as ritually clean for a specific period, typically 7 days. During this time, certain restrictions apply: no sexual relations, limited food categories, and avoidance of specific locations considered ritually impure. The constant background sound of the river continues as you accept these temporary limitations as the necessary maintenance of your newly achieved spiritual cleanliness. You emerge from the temple transformed, at least in spiritual status. Physically, you're exhausted, slightly dizzy from incense and fasting, marked with symbolic designs and smelling strongly of sacred oils. But according to Egyptian understanding, you've achieved the highest possible state of purification that a human can attain. The eternal sound of the Nile greets you as you exit the temple complex, its flowing waters symbolizing the perpetual cycle of purification and renewal that defines both Egyptian spirituality and the practical realities of staying clean in a pre-modern desert civilization. Now that our story has come to an end, imagine yourself drifting away from it all. The soothing sound of the Nile gradually fades into the distance, becoming softer, gentler, just a peaceful murmur in the background of your consciousness. The thoughts of strange unguents, toxic cosmetics, and bizarre hygiene practices begin to dissolve like morning mist over the great river, leaving only calm tranquility in their place. Your modern pillow welcomes you, infinitely more comfortable than any wooden headrest an ancient Egyptian might have used. The soft fabric against your skin bears no resemblance to linen scrubbed with natron and sand. You breathe deeply, each inhalation bringing fresh, clean air untainted by incense smoke or the heavy perfumes of the ancient world. With each exhalation, you release any remaining tension. Your body relaxes progressively, starting from your toes, flowing upward through your legs, abdomen, chest, and shoulders, finally reaching your neck and head. The journey through Egyptian hygiene practices fades further away with each breath. Your skin feels comfortable, neither dried by abrasive cleaning methods nor sticky with animal fats and oils. Your hair remains exactly as you prefer it, with no need for complete removal and heavy wigs. The distant sound of the Nile now merges with the gentle hum of modern comforts around you, creating a perfect symphony for deep relaxation. Your eyelids grow heavier as you reflect on the remarkable contrast between ancient struggles for cleanliness and our modern conveniences. A slight smile forms as you silently appreciate not having been born in ancient Egypt, where the pursuit of hygiene often resulted in consequences worse than the original uncleanliness. The realm of dreams opens invitingly before you, welcoming and peaceful. The images of ancient Egypt transform into gentle, colorful fragments dancing behind your closing eyelids. The sound of the Nile is now just a memory, a whisper barely perceptible in the depths of your relaxing mind. You surrender completely to restful sleep, your body totally at ease, as the final thoughts of Egyptian hygiene customs drift away like lotus petals on the current of a distant ancient river. Good night, relax, and sleep well.